PGCE Research Bites, from the team behind Emma and Tom Talk Teaching.
Hello and welcome to another episode of PGCE Research Bites, and I'm pleased to say that I'm joined by a friend of PGCE Research Bites, a returner. Matthew Green has just finished his PGCE secondary music with us here at Cardiff Met and has completed his second assignment and is here to talk to us about this today. It's a good example of the sort of thing that serving school teachers can do. So rather than very much a desk-based, literature-based assignment, which is the first one that you may have heard that came out on the podcast, this one is much more blending literature research with school-based inquiry and using it as a lens to make sense of what happens in the classroom. So this is a great worked example of the sort of thing that school colleagues can be doing no matter when in their career they are. So welcome, Matthew. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
And we're filming this time as well so that this one can come out as a video. So an added level of fun for this piece of work. So first of all, can you tell us what your topic was that you chose for this particular assignment and why it was that you chose it?
Yeah, absolutely. So broadly, I chose literacy and literacy in music. I chose that for a number of reasons. Obviously, coming into the teaching profession and realising really just how important literacy is to the learning process, just how important it is as a priority for all learners, especially in Curriculum for Wales as a cross-curricular responsibility. I felt quite passionately and an affinity with that topic. My background as well, I worked in the music industry for quite some time, and I wasn't a performer. I worked in sort of maybe more the business, admin, management side of things. And that was a lot of reading and writing, and I needed a good set of literacy skills to get me through that. So I really kind of connect literacy with my development as a musician and the career that I've had in the music industry. So that really appealed to me. And I also felt that there was a lot of opportunity maybe that in music we talk about literacy and we tend to focus on one specific part, which is oracy, which is speaking, because I think that is very well connected to performing and as a performing musician. And yet I also felt that in music we've got fantastic words for loads of different special things, and we could begin to explore those, and we use words to express our feelings about music, so we need kind of a literacy aspect there. So I felt that there was a lot more to be explored and that this would be a great opportunity to begin that exploration.
Well, yeah, you mentioned literacy as a cross-curricular responsibility. And for anyone who's watching or listening to this who's not from Wales, we have got a literacy framework. We have a numeracy framework and a digital competence framework. These are responsibilities that cut across our work as teachers, no matter our phase or subject. And I guess it's probably true to say there's been a bit of a sort of dividing up. We've sort of divvied up the work a bit in schools. We've looked at what we can do well and what maybe we can't do so well. And it's interesting that those of us in music have tended to gravitate towards the oracy side of things. We've tended to say this is what we do really well. And one of the things that really grabbed me about this piece of work was that you didn't go down that quite easy route, I suppose. You were really determined to keep it broad.
Yeah, I was definitely determined to keep it broad, and I think that was also influenced by my experiences during COVID times and having a sort of a virtual element to some of my clinical practice. So my first few, well, not my first few lessons, but a chunk of my first placement were spent teaching online. And that meant actually I wasn't able to do so much practical music. And I wasn't able to do so much oracy work, at least. So I was thinking more broadly, how has music and how has online teaching been able to allow me to investigate literacy in music? How has that changed the way that I taught? So that was kind of a big influencing factor, and I kind of came at literacy and music from maybe the other end of the spectrum to begin with, thinking that, okay, we could, if we wanted to, make literacy a really big part of music in secondary schools. And from that I kind of thought, well, why don't we? Because maybe selfishly I thought, well, we've got a lot to talk about in music. We've got a lot of different ways we can bring in so many authentic contexts, and I felt like I could relate to that from my professional experience as mentioned. So I was really keen to sort of grab a big slice of the pie and just run with it and see what music could do. And it was really interesting then to see how that viewpoint developed through the research and through my experiences in school.
So you took a look at the literature base that's out there, and I mean, I suppose I would have fully expected to see, for example, Robin Alexander in there, author of a Dialogic teaching companion. I know we talked about him a little bit a while ago in the programme. But actually you read more widely. You know, we've got people like Didow in there who I might not have expected to see in a music assignment. So what did you find kind of in the round from your reading work?
Yeah, well, firstly, I really enjoyed the reading, actually. Although I had to maybe take an extra step and make a bit of effort to find those articles and those resources that talked about literacy and talked about music. I did find them, but they weren't all necessarily from the UK. I'll start off though maybe talking a bit about the UK context. So I picked up sort of two key texts that I felt these were books by Didow. That was 2014. The title was something like A Secret Literacy. And again, I love to read the kind of book that other teachers will read. That you could go into a staff room and someone will either have or have read it and maybe lend you a copy and you can discuss it. And this book made a huge advocacy for literacy. It talked about how without literacy skills you can't learn anything else. It mentioned a little bit about the social importance of strong literacy skills. And I was really interested in that sort of sociology mindset as well. I put together that book with an earlier piece by Harrison, which was more to do with the mechanics of how we learn to read and again, why that's important. And those two formed kind of a basic view for me that, yeah, literacy is really important and I can well understand why. But those two books were very much focused on kind of the English curriculum, which is slightly different to how we're going in Wales now. And it was also very much what I would describe as language-based subjects. So Didow was an English teacher and Harrison, I think, similarly was an English teacher. And so there wasn't necessarily much consideration of how other subjects could get involved in that. So I needed to then start researching beyond, basically. So I looked at sources from Australia and America in particular. What I found was really interesting is in both Australia and in both America, they seem to have these cross-curricular responsibilities, but they seemed a little bit more embedded in the different subject areas, or content areas as it's referred to in America. So I had to learn a little bit of terminology and make sure I was up on that. And also in Australia, they've grouped subjects similar to how we've grouped in Wales, in that they've got areas of learning. So I wanted not just to have an understanding of how people were doing it, but I also needed an understanding of what specifically people were doing. So I just dived deep into various different strategies. Maybe people are familiar with things like DARTs, directed activities relating to text. So I read up on DARTs, I read up on sort of before, during and after strategies, things like ask the author, which I thought would work great as ask the composer, things like pre-reading strategies for when you're getting to know a different piece of music. And I found it fascinating, and all the while I was trying to connect this to my development as a teacher and what I was learning. It's also worth mentioning at this stage that in discussing literacy around music, I came into sort of three distinct areas. One which I would describe as sort of the literate literacy, the traditional literacy, reading and writing, not connected to any kind of subject or social intent. Then I'd say we have music literacy, which is what we know and associate with how to read music, how to read meaning into music maybe, and then maybe a critical literacy surrounding music. So that could be almost more media studies, almost more cultural capital, understanding why certain music and musics have maybe certain connotations within social situations and different cultures. So I had to make a decision pretty early on in order to structure my research. Right, I'm going down the literacy route, and so if it isn't to do with reading, writing or oracy, then it's not going to be relevant this time, interesting as it might be in future. I was very focused. Yeah.
And we've still got the big names of music literature in there, haven't we? I mean, I know we've got Derrida, we've got Robin Alexander, but I suppose the danger would be to go all the way down that literacy rabbit hole and not be able to pull it back to our subject domain. So it's interesting to see that, the mighty Keith Swanwick still has something to say to us. Lucy Green still has something to say to us. We've got Martin Fortley in there as well. So you were able to kind of mix those two disciplines together to create something useful.
That was really important for me, actually. Lucy Green's comments on sort of how we need literacy in music and what that means, that it connects with what Swanwick says as well. And I had this realization that music is multimodal. It's not purely literacy. Whenever we're writing about music, that is a technical skill, and we need a lot of literacy ability to write about music or write relating to music. But that's not necessarily doing music. Swanwick would describe any writing about music as music criticism. And so when I had that idea clear in my head, it enabled me to sort of separate things out a little bit more. And ultimately what all the music authors said, or the music specialists said was, yeah, fine, do your literacy. Whatever you do, though, it has to serve the point of the subject. And Robin Alexander as well comments on this. He says we need the skills to be able to speak. We need the skills to debate. We need the skills to talk for learning, which is essentially the whole purpose of dialogic teaching. But he said without things to speak about, without things to talk about, then it kind of makes the whole thing redundant. So for me, it became really cyclical almost. What are you going to do? Are you going to learn a subject and then learn how to talk and write about it? Or are you going to learn to talk and write through doing the subject? And that's a question that I can't answer. And I don't think any of the literature really was absolutely clear on without caveats. But I was also fine with that because I was just going through a process. I wasn't seeking to be an authority on this. It's just going through a process to develop my knowledge and understanding and ultimately a philosophy that was going to be research informed.
So having done that research then, you were able to put that into practice on placement in the classroom. And a big chunk of the assignment, you're writing about that process of, I suppose, interrogating what you read in the context of you teaching it in school and how that created a number of important turning points for your philosophy. So tell us a little bit about that kind of process that you went through in school.
Yeah, well, ultimately it was a very reflective process, and it involved a lot of moments of having read something and then trying to process it and seeing how it related to the school context. And it used several key resources, aka other teachers, experts who I had ready access to, and I could have discussions with and ask questions of, and that was so vital. So if I talk a little bit about those sort of moments and those sort of pieces of evidence and points of reflection, I had a couple of really good conversations with literacy coordinators at each one of my clinical practice schools. And that enabled me to understand what each school's approach to literacy within the school was and try and relate that to my experiences in that school. So obviously the first placement I was mostly online, and some of the things that we were able to discuss with the literacy coordinator in that school, I was able to easily implement into my online lessons basically. Whereas in the second placement we were really going in for much more practical music because we hadn't been able to do so much of that. So at a certain point I felt, maybe it's more of a struggle to do this organically. But that was also a reflection on my ability as a teacher at that point, as I was also having a lot to process, having gone from online learning into the physical classroom, and that's hard work. So the conversations were really great and really helpful, but had to also be a bit pragmatic. I wasn't just going to down tools and tell everyone to stop playing the xylophone whilst we get our books out and do tons of writing about the history of the xylophone, for example. You know, whilst that might be great fun, it wasn't what I was there to do. So those conversations helped me gain more knowledge, but helped me sort of contextualise and be quite pragmatic. That being said, when I did manage to try out different techniques, I reflected on them. I wondered why they worked, what was good about them. We were introduced quite early on to something called the Freya model, which I really liked as a great way of exploring terminology of or specialist vocabulary, looking at the etymology of a word, looking at the characteristics of the word, relating it to what students know already, and finding examples of it, non-examples. And I found that a really great tool to have sort of up my sleeve. And that was a big step forward for me. And I became quite adept at sort of doing it in full, but also cherry picking little bits of it, so that when I was working in practical music, if a word came up, if a student said, "Oh, why have we only got 5 notes on our instrument today? Why are we using these 5 notes?" I could talk about the pentatonic scale. I could help them relate that word pent, meaning 5, to a pentagram or whatever. Not a penthouse, or incidentally, which was one of the non-examples that a student came up with, which was just brilliant. But I felt then that I was developing my own skills as a literacy, as a music specialist who could involve literacy. I looked very, very carefully and very, very critically at the music, the main qualification for music in secondary schools in Wales, which is the WJEC GCSE in music. I'm sure others are available, but that seemed to me the one that was, it was taught in both of my placement schools and would probably be likely that I'd be teaching in future years as well. And so I went through the entire syllabus, I went through the examiner's reports, I went through mark schemes, I went through SAMs, I went through past papers, everything. And I was looking at that to establish, almost like a systematic review of what literacy skills you would need. Some of the questions, some of the skills are explicitly assessed. And there's other areas that I felt was hidden literacy or secret literacy, where there'd be a cap on your ability to secure the highest marks if you didn't have good literacy skills. A specific example would be that in the examiner's reports, they regularly reference the not program notes, but the briefs that students would write for their own compositions. So a student would choose what they want to write music about, and then they would write a brief about it, or they would write some justification for why they've written that particular piece of music. Time and time again in the examiner's report, it said the compositions that were most successful had really clear and well-written student briefs. And those student briefs aren't assessed, but there's a clear correlation between well-written briefs and the highest marks. So I put 2 and 2 together to basically conclude that if students don't have good literacy skills, they won't have the technical vocabulary that is expected of them in the GCSE appraising exam. They might not have the communicative written skills to write a good brief to support their composition. And ultimately, as a music specialist, I would hope that the music would speak for itself, but the reality, not just in WJEC, but in the industry as well, from my own experience, is that the music doesn't speak for itself. We have to back it up with words. That's the way we convince people to come to concerts and gigs, is usually by the written word, or if not by the written word, by maybe speaking or creating video content, maybe audio content. But traditionally, and for a long time, it has been through oracy or through written communication. So I could make those connections as to why it was important beyond just the assessment criteria. So that really informed me thinking, well, it's actually quite a huge chunk of the assessment criteria and the syllabus, whether it's explicit or not. We should do more on it. However, just anchoring back, I'm a music specialist, so if I spend 35% of my time just doing literacy, then I'm doing a disservice to music. And however, that wasn't my viewpoint at the time. That's a viewpoint post the experience. I did something that was inspired by some of the literature that I read. I read a piece by Ness that basically they'd done a study that they'd observed about 1,000 hours or maybe more hours of classroom teaching and codified everything that happened in the classroom and anything that was to do with literacy, direct instruction to do with literacy, they'd given it a special code, and then they worked out what percentage of classroom time was spent doing literacy. And I read this, and it was something like 3% of time spent in lessons was on literacy and teaching students how to read or how to write or how to answer a question, whatever literacy skill it was. Well, 3%, that's really terrible. That's really shocking. But it gave me kind of a baseline. And so I did some observations in my clinical practice school then, and I didn't observe thousands of hours, although it might have felt like it at the time. It wasn't thousands of hours, and it was a real pleasure to observe as well, I might add. But I just kept a rough tally of any time that I saw, well, a good tally of any time that I saw literacy being taught or being explicit. And then I went home and I worked out the numbers, and I was honest in my reflections as well. It wasn't the most robust study, but it was just intended as to be comparative and just so that I could index how close things were. And I found out we're pretty much bang on 3%, give or take. And so I realised what I was experiencing was fairly consistent and fairly reflective. However, a couple of key differences. A lot of the lessons that were observed in Ness's study, they weren't practical subjects. And so I kind of thought, well, hold on, 3%, it doesn't sound that much, but when you think you've got 60 minutes in a lesson, of which time is allowed for coming in, time is allowed for going out, time is allowed for behaviour management, and all the other things that go on in a classroom, which when I was starting to read the literature, I wasn't really considering. So when I was in that classroom and I got all my data and I got all my specific classroom understanding, I came away from that actually thinking, do you know what, that's not too bad, and it's good quality stuff, and it's not taking away from the music making. So I started to build a picture now in my head that it wasn't just research, there was clear observation and there was conversation. And there was a big turning point when I started having discussions with my mentor just about this kind of thing. Okay, we've got all these cross-curricular responsibilities. What's the intention of the department? And ultimately it became clear in that moment, well, we are a music department, we are music specialists, we are teachers, and we have an important role in teaching lots of different aspects. But if we do a disservice to the music teaching, we're going to be doing a disservice to those students' literacy skills anyway, because they'll have all this literacy ability, but they won't have anything to apply it to because they won't have the subject and the content knowledge. So that for me was a big moment and a big turning point in sort of developing that philosophy and that experience. And all of these different points that I've mentioned, they were summarised as reflections, as points of evidence, as tangible moments in that journey for me as part of this assignment. And reading, I've had time away from this assignment now, and reading it back was really interesting for me, and thinking, oh yeah, that was a big step for me. And I can kind of trace, that's the moment where I become, I changed from being an academic researcher to a reflective practitioner, and that was really nice for me. And there's also a moment where I think, well, that's where I go from becoming maybe a PGCE university-focused student to someone who's a student teacher seeking to develop a vision and a philosophy, hopefully for a career in teaching. So yeah, that was maybe a short summary.
Well, everyone talks very glibly, I think, don't they, about being a reflective practitioner, but I think that outline really shows how many kind of bits there are to doing that successfully. We've got that very rigorous look at the literature, but that kind of is nothing without a context in which to place it. But then once you're in the context, you have to not become kind of submerged in that context and unable to step back and take a look at what's going on and get a bit of distance from what's going on. So, I mean, how have you found that process of doing that, and how do you see that carrying on in future when, of course, your workload as a teacher is going to double? It's a tricky prospect, isn't it? Yeah.
I think one of the challenges of doing it on the PGCE is fundamentally I didn't have a huge body of context to start with. I've been in teaching for 2 seconds, and then all of a sudden I'm trying to reflect on teaching whilst at the same time learn about teaching, and that was a challenge. So I think maybe going forward I would have just a little bit more experience and a little more grounding, and then I'd maybe enable myself to be a little bit more selective about perhaps even my research. I could maybe be bolder to discount stuff. However, if you are to discount research, I think maybe that because you feel like it doesn't suit my context, then what's the point of the research? I think actually it's better to say, well, that's not relevant to my specific context, so I'm going to read it. I'm going to find out what's relevant to someone else's, and you can learn a little bit more. So I think having that additional context will be really, really helpful and really, really beneficial. I think as well, working with other people, because I had my own decisions and this was my own assignment, so I got on with my own thing basically. But if you're working in a school with other reflective practitioners, then you can discuss, you can talk, you can agree a kind of combined focus. I can go away and read a couple of books and some articles. Colleagues can do the same, and we can support one another. And the turning points for me were usually anchored to discussions, because it's at that point where you think you know something until you have to sit down and explain it and teach it, as I've learned, much to my peril. So having that time to go away, learn, and know that you're going to come back and speak to someone about it, I think will be really helpful to support me as a reflective practitioner, and hopefully support others as well. And from that, then you can see how the research relates to your context, because maybe you can try some things out. I might try something out, someone can observe me. And in fact, in the research that I was reading about darts, it was saying that the way that they're most effectively used is a group of people get together, they decide which darts they're going to use, and they share that pedagogy and they share those tools in multiple different contexts, multiple different lessons, and then they get back together, they feedback what worked, what didn't. I just think that's a great example, not just of reflective practice, but collaboration as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think, it will get harder because time will be at a push, but I think there's ways around that.
And the kind of ultimate aim of this particular piece of work was to crystallise your philosophy around something. So to put you on the spot slightly, by the time you've done all of this work, and I mean, we can see what a huge amount of work has gone into this. This is not a glib kind of, I just think it's this. There's obviously been a huge number of ingredients to this. How did that philosophy turn out in the end? Well,
shall I read it?
Read away.
And we'll see if I've changed my mind on anything in the last couple of months. Okay. I remember the philosophy actually being something that was really enjoyable to write. It felt like the culmination of the assignment, and I put it in bold as well.
Yes, I remember that.
So this is what I said. I believe that we should be ambitious and optimistic. Music teachers should seek out and create authentic opportunities to implement quality research-backed literacy instruction within the subject area in a way that supports improved outcomes for students in both music and literacy learning. Rather than finding tension between subject-specific demands and the requirements of the literacy and numeracy framework, music teachers should seek to recognise the opportunity that effective literacy teaching will give with regards to deeper musical understanding and learning. And I still agree with that. And it's a philosophy, so I don't give away any clues as to how that can be done. And it's more about why we should do it that way. And I do think that's that philosophy encapsulates what I hope to get to, but when and if I'll ever get to that point is another question entirely, but I do hope so. So yeah, that's my
That's
philosophy.
your philosophy. Well, I mean, I suppose everybody comes into the PGCE with beliefs and values and philosophies, and then I suppose those get challenged from all different angles, whether that's just going into the classroom and finding out what it's like, or the reading, the assignments, all the discussions that you talk about with all the people who are involved. I mean, how, if at all, has your own wider philosophy changed? I mean, you came onto the programme and I know you had strong beliefs about how music should be taught, and you've had 2 school experiences and you've done all of this work. Has there been a huge change? Have there been huge challenges? Has that philosophy survived intact?
It's definitely changed and definitely developed as I understood things maybe in a slightly different way, and undeniably changed a little bit, to get points for cheesiness. So everyone changes, don't they, on a PGCE? Maybe I can mention about teaching in general and my sort of understanding and expectation, then I'll talk a bit about the music side of things. So I think I was quite surprised that myself, I'm generally pretty relaxed, quite liberal, and there's a lot of things in life that don't really bother me and I don't let them stress. But children talking while I'm talking, and other things, like, very soon became clear to me that I wasn't going to let that happen. So I think my philosophy around some things like that, just practical day to day, and became really clear. And it's not just children talking while I'm talking. I want it to be a fair and positive learning environment. So I found myself being very, very consistent. Not necessarily strict, but very, very consistent and firm and fair, and not afraid to use a behaviour policy as and when. And I thought that was going to be maybe, I wouldn't have expected that, basically. I thought maybe I'd be the kind of teacher be like, oh yeah, you're saying something so interesting, I really want to hear what you have to say. When in actual fact, I more or less be like, it's great, but hand up, okay. And so that was really interesting. That was a bit of a journey. And with regards to music as well, I absolutely love music, and there's been times when I haven't absolutely loved music, to be honest. And doing the PGCE has been a wonderful time for me to really explore my knowledge, understand how I came to acquire that knowledge, and maybe understand what I can do with that knowledge. And during that process, I kind of think, well, what would be better for another generation of musicians? How could they benefit from a more improved or a changed musical education? And ultimately that's all I can really hope for or philosophize on, is that whatever I can do in my music teaching will benefit the individuals. And so I think my philosophy as a music teacher actually is less about me and more about the students now. It's more about whatever context I'll be working in at the time, more about whatever department I'll be working in at the time. That will be a huge defining feature of my philosophy. So if it requires me to put my classical music head on, I'll be happy to do that. And if it requires me to maybe go down a slightly different musical route, then I'll be happy to do that as well. And I think that is a testament to what we are taught to do on this PGCE, which is we're not taught this is how you teach music and this is what you should do. We're taught these are the principles of good teaching, and you're going to have to develop your own philosophy and work out a few other bits to fill in the gaps. But I think that's right. I think we do need to do that as subject specialists. And that kind of connects to my thoughts on literacy as well, I suppose, in that if you went to a school or you had a class of students who were all hugely advanced with their literacy, hugely numerate, then you can do different things with those students than you would do with students that really did need that extra support with their literacy or with their numeracy. So yeah, in essence, I think my philosophy is less about me, more about the students, more about the needs of the students, and I'm pleased that it has gone that way, because naturally when you decide to do a PGCE, everyone, whether they will admit to it or not, needs to make that decision slightly selfishly. it's a hard year. You're going to enter a challenging profession. You need to make that decision based on whether it's right for you, and you need to make that decision based on whether it's right for your life and your skill set and so on and so forth. And so, of course, an element of my decision to do a PGCE and become a teacher was selfish. And as I've developed the skills to be, well, I hope I've developed the skills to be a teacher, I'd like to maybe just let go of that and focus more and more consistently on the needs of the students, musical or otherwise. Yeah. So I think that's how my philosophy has shifted.
Well, just picking up on that last point you made, I mean, we're filming this on the very last day of the PGCE programme. So you are a freshly minted NQT, newly qualified teacher going off to a third school. You know, you've experienced 2 schools on the programme. You're off to a third school where I suppose in some ways you'll have more freedom to do what you want to do. Maybe you'll have less time to do certain things because there'll be a lot more teaching to be done. Thinking about the research side of things, the kind of research and inquiry side of things, I mean, you've made 2 appearances on Research Bites, which kind of implies strongly that it's gone pretty well for you, the research side of things. How do you see that going forward now into the future? Have you got a kind of wish list of things you want to find out about or things you want to read about or do? And how do you see that kind of being part of your work as a teacher now as you head into a long and happy career?
Yeah, thank you. Long and happy, that's a bonus,
yes,
isn't it?
Both.
Great. I think what I need to do going forward really is separate out research and inquiry. I love to read, and I think keeping on top of just, maybe it's a blog, maybe it's a few articles, maybe it's a book that you've got on the go at any given point, just to constantly be making sure you're adding something, making sure you're learning something or challenging a viewpoint. That would be my inquiry. And if something comes up in a lesson, or if I have a student that has a particular requirement, then I can make sure I'm doing some inquiry around that. Research for me on this level, it requires a substantial amount of time and a substantial amount of focus. And so, you know, level 7 master's level research, I think it might be a bit of an ask to do alongside an NQT year. However, throughout an NQT year or years thereafter, throughout my inquiry, I might begin to get more and more interested in certain areas, and then decide ultimately that there could come a point where I want to pull the trigger and go and do a master's, top up the master's, do a dissertation, and that would be something that I'd really look forward to. But so inquiry all the time, consistent. Research, there might be specific bursts of energy that are dedicated to specific research as and when the needs require, and then there might be sort of a bigger chunk of research, sort of more academic research in the future. Because I have been quite a geek and I have quite enjoyed the research side of things, and ultimately the reason why I've enjoyed it is because it's helped me improve as a student teacher, and hopefully it's helped me to have some skills and qualities that will help me be a good teacher as well.
Well, thank you, Matthew. There's an enormous amount of stuff there for any teacher watching this. You know, there's takeaways, whether you're a music specialist or a literacy specialist or something completely different. But that brings us to the end of another Research Bite. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for being with us while we discussed that piece of work, and we'll be back soon.